In the traditional approach to application development, you have multiple stakeholders, you might have the multiple departments and groups, and probably other vendors you outsource the development to. And all these are actually part of the overall software development life cycle, or the SDLC. Most of us are actually familiar with the stages of application lifecycle management. You first start with the business requirements, and then you actually have the development team to create the actual application. Someone else tests the application, like your QA team and so on, and then you actually put that application in production, right? So this approach is often fragmented by techniques. It's also fragmented by frameworks, different processes, different people, the tools that are actually impacting the final product, especially in terms of features, the cost that it actually takes to develop the application, and all the different overheads, that you actually have, schedule, quality, performance, tons of other administrative overheads, right? Now, in today's environments, you actually have things like DevOps and cloud computing, so it's actually accelerating the way that you actually develop applications, just like we actually discussed in the previous lessons, right? So DevOps, or Development Plus Operations, is actually part of the SDLC of many organizations nowadays, right? Because DevOps offer a process and different frameworks with open source tools that actually integrates at all parts of the application lifecycle. And you're actually going to learn about DevOps later in the course, in more detail. Now, a lot of the landscape of modern web development is actually a compilation of great libraries and tons of web frameworks, right? The truth is that libraries and frameworks both end up being equally complex to work with. For example, nowadays you actually have frameworks like React, Angular, Ember, jQuery, Python with Flask and Django, Ruby on Rails, and many others, right? But why should actually you care about this if this is a web application penetration testing course, right? Well, you actually need to become familiar with all these key technologies in order for you to completely understand how applications can be abused, how you can actually break those applications, and how these frameworks can also introduce vulnerabilities to modern applications. In the past, a web application will look like this, right? So you have a front end that you will access with your web browser, what we typically call the presentation layer. And then you actually have the application in the back, and then typically a database behind it, right? Nowadays, we have microservices where all these components are, in separate containers or separate Docker containers, right? Then you actually have things like Kubernetes, right? And, Kubernetes actually is used to manage and automate the deployment of those containers, and also things like OpenShift, right? To bring all those things into large enterprise environments. Now, you also have to become familiar with what are web application programming interfaces, or APIs, right? APIs can also be abused, they can be exploited, and you actually have to pay attention to them, because most of applications nowadays, most modern applications today actually use APIs. Now, in some cases, an application may reside locally, and then maybe actually accessing other resources in the cloud, or a database in a different geographical location, or everything can actually reside in the cloud, right? So you have things like multi-tenancy deployments, also hybrid approaches. So many different type of technologies and implementations, right? Now, in this course, we will go through many of these frameworks and many of these technologies. We will go over cloud security. We will go over DevOps and so on, even before you start learning the web application security testing tools and the techniques, for penetration testing, right? So this is because you must first learn or at least have an understanding of these concepts in order for you to actually be successful and a good web application penetration testing. Now, since I have your attention, another thing that I want to remind you is that we actually have created a GitHub repository that I'm actually adding tons and tons, actually hundreds, if not thousands of references for you. There are a few sections in that GitHub repository that are extremely relevant to this video course. And of course, they cover a lot of references and material that we actually have been covering in the other video courses that are part of this series. Here I actually have links to dozens of tools, blog posts, information about the underlying technologies, frameworks, and programming languages used in web applications, things like open source threat intelligence, other things like reverse engineering, decompilers, and in some other cases, things that can be extremely useful whenever it comes to penetration testing and anything around cybersecurity, right? So you can access this repository by just going to the rfhacking.org and then clicking on the GitHub repository link.